You hear from people all the time who get so just incredibly frustrated and disgusted of politics, who feel like it doesn't matter who they vote for, nothing ever really changes for them, and that government is fundamentally broken. And they're not wrong, but I don't think people understand why that is. And one of the main reasons is that there are a bunch of politicians in state capitals around the country, including the Florida legislature, which is one of the very worst offenders, who are intentionally breaking government. And they are breaking government, the government that is closest to the people, cities and counties and school boards, the local places where people actually know their elected officials, have relationships with their elected officials, the one branch of government that is usually best at actually solving problems and responding to people's needs and not getting lost in just like cable TV shouting debates. And there's a particularly powerful tool that these state level politicians are using to break government. We're going to tell you about that today. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular emphasis on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, seeking rents, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. So today is day 99 of the Florida legislature's 60-day legislative session. I'm going to have to record at least a quick podcast tomorrow just so I can do a day 100 podcast. Florida lawmakers are still in Tallahassee, or leadership is anyway, negotiating a final state budget that does seem to finally be coming in for a landing. It feels like we could get an announcement that a deal is done, as early as maybe even this afternoon. There is still an awful lot of fine print that we're all waiting to see. Boy, there's a few terms can put people to sleep faster than budget conforming bill, but man, a lot of bad stuff can happen in a budget conforming bill. So we're gonna have to wait to see what exactly is coming down that pike. So we may still be a week out from knowing the full details here, but at least an end is in sight. The 60-day legislative session should end before day 115 or so at least. But today we're gonna do something different. We're gonna do another interview podcast. My guest today is Katie Belanger. She's the lead consultant at the Local Solutions Support Center, which is an organization that focuses on the issue of preemption. Now, that's an incredibly dry term, but it is so important. Preemption is the method by which, or the mechanism that state governments use to strip power and rights and problem-solving ability away from local governments. If you've ever run into frustration with like why your city council can't do something, or why your county commission or school board can't do something, or why you voted for a referendum and then nothing changed, that's because the Florida legislature and other state legislatures around the country doing the same thing are stepping in to essentially undercut their own local governments and consolidate power in Tallahassee. This is one of the most common ways that special interests seek rents in Tallahassee and in other state capitals. But the genesis of this was I was having a conversation a week or two ago with a bunch of really smart people, including some folks like some high-ranking like business types, some folks in like media entertainment space, even like mergers and acquisition space, like a bunch of people who, from what I could tell, were pretty brilliant and knew a ton of stuff about areas that I have no expertise whatsoever in. So I was fascinated to learn from them. And anyway, in this conversation, somehow the subject of preemption came up. And some of these business folks, again, brilliant people as far as I could tell, had no idea what it was, hadn't even heard the term. The notion that state government was essentially stripping powers away from local government, from cities and counties and school boards, they had no idea that was happening, even though this has been one of the biggest state level issues across the country, particularly, although as you'll hear, not exclusively in red states, essentially punishing blue cities is where this most frequently takes place. So that got me thinking, I need to talk more about preemption. I need to find people that are smarter about talking about preemption than I am, and just sort of like do I'm kind of envisioning this as like a preemption 101 podcast. And again, I could think of nobody better to do this than Katie Belanger. So I hope you'll find the conversation interesting and enlightening. I know I sure did. So here it is. Here is Katie Belanger. Katie Belanger, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Jason. I'm glad to be here.
Hey, this is great. So, the way I've envisioned this, I referenced this in the intro as kind of like a preemption 101 sort of thing. But before I dive too deeply into that, maybe for folks listening, tell folks a bit more about yourself and about the Local Solutions Support Center.
Sure. Well, I am a Wisconsin girl. I was born in Milwaukee and now live in Madison. And my background is really steeped in advocacy and organizing work. I've worked for campaigns and elected officials and nonprofits and done a lot of work, particularly in the LGBTQ plus community. And I found my way to the Local Solutions Support Center where it's been a joy to be able to work across so many different issues and with so many different movements because we are all being impacted by the abuses of state preemption.
Right,
And so
right.
the Local Solutions Support Center is the national hub that's dedicated to countering those abuses and to strengthen local democracy by advancing home rule reform.
Yeah, that makes I will say it has been an enormous resource or enormously valuable resource for me just as someone like covering a specific state, getting a sense of like what's happening around the country and you realize just how much of this is like coordinated across states. You also get a sense
Absolutely.
of what's probably coming if it hasn't already started in Florida, so it's an incredibly valuable resource to folks who care about this stuff. Okay, so let's do preemption 101 and start sort of as broadly as possible, but for folks that don't know what is preemption.
So, preemption is actually a neutral policy tool, and it is simply when a higher level of government restricts or withdraws authority from a lower level of government to act. Traditionally, preemption has been used to sort of set a minimum standard. And my example is usually civil rights laws. I think this is a
Mhm.
good example of good preemption, where the federal government sets minimum standards about protected classes, and then states and municipalities can go further to meet the needs of their communities. And I've seen this particularly in my work in the LGBTQ plus community. I used to run our statewide advocacy group in Wisconsin, and our state was the first to pass sexual orientation protections for gay and lesbian and bisexual folks in 1982,
Oh,
but
wow.
we didn't protect trans and non-binary folks. So when I was running our group, we were doing local ordinance work to protect on the basis of gender identity and expression. So the lower level of government was able to build on the floor that the higher level of government created. Today, that is not how preemption is being used. And that's why we say it's being abused, because preemption is being used to target and harm historically excluded communities. We look particularly at BIPOC, LGBTQ plus people, women, immigrants, and working folks. And that means we're working on everything from worker protections to civil rights laws to environmental protections to public health laws and so on, because this tool is being weaponized to roll back or stymie progress that we're making at the local level.
Can you just to put a little bit finer point on that, like, can you give us an example of what you mean by like where how preemption has been used to like roll back progress or just give us a few examples of what you would consider abusive preemptions?
Absolutely. I think one of the clearest examples that we've seen for a long time is actually minimum wage preemption.
Hmm.
The federal government hasn't raised the minimum wage from seven and a quarter in far too long, right?
Right.
So states in some places have been looking at raising the minimum wage, but generally speaking, the states aren't passing those laws. It's the cities. The cities are trying to
Right.
raise the minimum wage to make sure that the people who live there can afford to live there and work there, right? And so we see local communities trying to pass minimum wage, the $15 an hour campaigns that we see all over the country. Cities like Milwaukee, where I grew up, passed a higher minimum wage than the state or federal government. And the state of Wisconsin then said, oh, no, you can't do that. We're actually withdrawing your
Right.
authority to be able to set your own minimum wage. And so then it defaulted back to the federal level.
Yeah, that makes sense. And not a surprise. We've had that exact same situation in Florida where there are a number of communities. Miami Beach was one of them that set a local minimum wage because, of course, Miami Beach, most expensive place to live in the state, just about, right? And then the legislature stepped in and preempted that. And not only that, they eventually got to the point where just last year, they have now preempted local governments from requiring their own contractors pay higher wages. Like, I mean, these are companies paid with taxpayer money. The governments that control this taxpayer money are not even allowed to set the terms of those contracts,
Right.
essentially.
Exactly. And we've seen things in Florida too where the state has tried to preempt policies that local governments haven't even started to
Right.
try to explore, like predictive scheduling. We saw a
Right.
few sessions ago where no one had actually passed a predictive scheduling ordinance, but there was no way the Florida legislature was going to let anyone even explore that.
Yeah. I actually I want to put a pin in that because I want to come back to that in just a sec. But like, sort of more broadly speaking, is it one of the ways I kind of find myself thinking about it is like, as you mentioned, preemption is a neutral tool, which is an idea that gets drilled into me all the time by folks in this space. Because as a journalist working in Florida, I'm used to just associating it with negativity at this point.
Right.
But is it fair to think of like a positive use of preemption is maybe when you're setting a floor? And an abusive preemption is setting a ceiling or or breaking up the floor essentially.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a large part of it is
Hmm.
that you want to be using preemption to set that minimum standard that a community can go further to address their unique needs. Every community is different.
Right.
Every community has a different context, a different need, a different population, right? And so part of the beauty of local democracy is that the people who are governing you are your neighbors. They know
Right.
you and they know what you need, right? The other part that preemption we consider abusive, you're absolutely right. The setting a ceiling that localities can't go further, but it's also about intent and impact. And so a lot of the bills that we're tracking, and we're tracking 658 bills across the country this session.
My
And
God.
the things, yeah, exactly. And that's up. Last session was 411.
Wow.
So we've seen a huge increase this year. And, it's the kinds of issues that we're seeing now are intended to target and harm very specific communities. We're
Hmm.
seeing preemptions that are being used to advance a federal authoritarian agenda. I think sanctuary city policies are actually one of the best examples today. And we've seen sanctuary city preemption for years, but it is certainly a heightened issue right now as we see our federal government trying to militarize local police forces, right? It's everything that we're seeing in Los Angeles right now. And
Right.
they're using these preemptions to specifically sow fear and discord and be able to very specifically harm very specific people.
That makes sense. If I could just elaborate a little bit more on sort of how those sanctuary city preemptions work, because that's not an area that I've written a ton about, so I'm not like really
Sure.
well versed in it. For folks, like how is that abused?
So a sanctuary city policy, and we've seen this in immigration issues, and we've also seen this in transgender sanctuary cities. And so basically cities can proactively say we are going to protect certain populations or we are not going to comply with laws that would harm certain
Right.
populations, right? So we see this a lot again in the immigration context. It's local police forces saying we are not going to collaborate with ICE, right?
Right.
So we see these policies passed in local communities to say this is what we stand for. We stand for our residents, and some of those residents are immigrants, and we love them, and they're our neighbors too. And then the state comes in and say, you can't have the authority to pass those policies, or
Right.
you must comply with the laws that we have passed, or you must comply proactively with federal law.
Right.
And so what we're seeing now is not just the preemption, but also punitive aspects of the preemption. So in Tennessee, for example, they passed a preemption of sanctuary cities for immigrants, and it made it a felony for local elected officials to support immigration sanctuary city legislation. So now we're
Wow.
criminalizing our duly elected
We're criminalizing,
officials.
yeah, criminalizing political positions. Right.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Wow. And not to get too far upstream, but like in Florida, we've done a lot of this. But at the same time, we have an administration that has, for instance, refused to comply with like Medicaid expansion rules. Like we had
Right.
I did a podcast, I don't know, sometime last year with a professor at Georgetown who's an expert on Medicaid policy and the federal government trying to implement continuous coverage for kids just to make sure kids didn't lose their health insurance
Mhm.
coverage. The state of Florida refused to comply with that. Sued the only state in the country that continued to fight that.
Yep.
But at the same time, they're turning around when locals disagree with policies out of the state. They're criminalizing that opposition, essentially.
Right. Or removing them from office, which has
Right.
happened in Florida with some of your district attorneys,
Right.
right? And we see that in prosecutorial discretion all over the place, Georgia and Missouri, as well as Florida, where duly elected prosecutors who've traditionally had the discretion to say, these are our priorities, and this is how we're going to spend our tax dollars and our resources, being held accountable to state officials, whether it's the governor or the attorney general, who
Right.
said, if you don't prosecute it, I will, or we'll just take you out of office.
Right, right. And that actually that makes me in my mind I've been sort of thinking about like the evolution of preemption in a way that like we now see like you said local officials could just get yanked from office by governors and attorney generals. We also see in Florida we've seen stuff like taking over of local assets like
Yes.
in the city of Gainesville, which is one of the more progressive cities in Florida. The governor and legislature essentially commandeered the state's electrical utility. The city's electrical utility. You've also seen a lot of the discussions around taxes tends to be they pass a lot of legislation that essentially erode local government's ability to raise revenue, right? Like attacking
Right.
what they can tax, how much they can tax, and stuff, passing it as branding it as tax cuts, even though they're cutting somebody else's revenue source and not dealing with sort of leaving them to deal with the consequences. Is it right in your mind to think of those kinds of things as preemption as well? Is it a broader category? Is it slightly different? Or just I'm sort of curious how you think about what preemption actually looks like as it evolves.
Yeah, those are definitely things we consider preemption. And
Hmm.
again, our lens is really about removing or restricting the authority of locals to govern in the ways that they have been elected to do. And
Right.
so, budget control is absolutely one of the pieces. And we saw this in Florida in 2021 with HB1, which was about both protest, criminalizing protest, but
Right.
it was also local budget control. And it was saying
Right.
that localities could not decrease their police budget, full
Right.
stop. And so it actually brought up a lot of really interesting questions. What if you have a small community that has only a handful of police officers and someone quits or someone retires,
Right.
right? You're going to have a change in the budget just as course of normal personnel issues, right? And that would have or could have led to the state taking over your budget.
Right.
And so there's definitely an overreach here. And it definitely has evolved. And when I started this work, I joined this team in 2018, and it was predominantly corporate elites advancing a deregulatory agenda.
Right.
And they had secured the support of state legislators. And so they were able to stop legislation at the state level that would have impacted their bottom lines. And so organizers and advocates were turning to local communities to say, this is
Right.
where we can still do good work at the city council, right? And so that's when these folks realized, oh, we have more doors that we have to close. These
Right.
folks have more opportunities to create change. And so that's where we saw the proliferation of abusive preemption, particularly in economic justice, housing, worker protections, in a lot of those areas. Since that time, we've really seen, and I think COVID was a time when we really started to see the intent of abusive preemption become more overtly racist, more overtly targeting these historically excluded communities that I've been talking about, and where these corporate elites found common cause with social conservatives.
Right.
And so this is why today we see a lot of the abusive preemption around DEI initiatives, anti-LGBTQ plus issues, immigration issues, and we see far more of the cultural and social issues being targeted through abusive preemption.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that because as I think back to when I first became aware of the issue, so back, I want to say 2012, so more than a decade now. I'm
Mhm.
I'm in Orlando, and there was a local county referendum to require, this is obviously a huge tourism economy down here. So we've got tons of
Mhm.
low wage workers, tons of workers that working essentially part-time hours. They're juggling two or three part-time jobs. Nobody has like steady employment. And so there was a referendum to require large employers to provide paid sick leave to their workers, right?
Mhm.
and
Absolutely.
and that passed overwhelmingly. But this is literally true. Lobbyists for Disney, Universal, and Darden Restaurants, which is
Yep.
headquartered in Orlando and was the parent company of like Olive Garden and Red Lobster at the time, they went to Tallahassee and got a law passed that said cities or counties can't make businesses do anything about benefits, right? And so
Exactly.
that was a corporate preemption. But you're right that it is expanded, and one that I've been sort of thinking more and more about is just like, I don't know if this is the right framing, but like just sort of like political power or political suppression type preemptions. And so I'm thinking of
Yes.
a couple of years ago, I was putting together a story just trying to like pull together a list of preemptions that had passed the legislature the last like 10 years or something. It was like a monstrously long list. But
Mm.
I hadn't even known, but they had preempted local communities from adopting ranked choice voting in their own elections, right?
Yep.
Like
Yep.
I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on ranked choice voting, but why does the state get to decide how like Sarasota County conducts its own local
Exactly.
elections, right? And we had a bill just a couple of years ago where they actually weakened campaign finance laws in Florida. First time
Yep.
in my time doing that, they've gone backwards on that. But as part of that, they also made sure to preempt locals from adopting stronger campaign finance laws, again, in their own local elections. And all of that seemed to be built around sort of rigging the system for like for Tallahassee specifically, but also for like entrenched people in power already. And this
Absolutely.
and this is all a very long-winded lead up to. I wonder, like, how do you think about the types of preemptions, or like when you're categorizing them? What are some of the areas you see it most used, or just how do you think about the different ways it affects people?
Right. Well, I think you're really hitting the nail on the head because it's just the evolution of abusive preemption has become more, like I said, it's more overtly racist and it's more overtly about power consolidation.
Right.
And we're traditionally looking at power consolidation at the state level, but this is absolutely like what's happening in our federal government is building on the foundation that abusive preemption has created. And so, I think one of the things that we've seen, another example of this evolution is with what we call Death Star preemption.
Right.
And so, historically, this Death Star preemption, a good example is 2015 in Michigan, where there was one bill that preempted a whole host of worker protections, minimum wage, paid sick, all of the pieces, right? So, it was one bill that was about a specific set of policies that all sort of had a theme. Now, what we're seeing, we call it Death Star 2.0, and Texas had a bill, HB 2127, that was passed not this session, but in the previous session. And what it does is basically erode the ability of local governments to function. Full stop. So it's saying that, I mean, there's all sorts of other things in this bill too. The heat safety protections that Florida passed
Right.
last year were in this Texas bill 2 years ago. But it also said if the state has not expressly given permission to localities to govern on an issue, it does not have the authority.
Right.
And so it's just really aiming at
I,
stopping
I I'm
local
so, I'm
governments
sorry.
from acting.
I'm sorry. Can I jump in there? Because I don't. That took a
Yeah.
second for that to click.
Yeah.
Did the law says that local government can't do anything unless there's a law expressly allowing it to do that? Is that what you just said?
Yes. That is
My
exactly
God.
what I just said. Yes.
Holy cow.
Yes. So it really is these proponents of abusive preemption are getting extremely clear about what their aim
Right.
is, which is to target and harm specific communities and just erode our democracy completely. And that's what I mean when I say what's happening at the federal government is building on what we
Right.
have seen. Those of us who've been fighting abusive preemption have been fighting Project 2025 for longer than
Right.
we've known what to call it.
Right. Longer than the brand existed.
Exactly, exactly.
Right. That's really interesting. So I was going to ask you about this sort of evolution of what folks call Death Star preemptions. So in Florida, it seems like I know where we might be going next, having heard about the
Mhm.
about that law. That was in Texas, you said, is that right?
That was Texas.
Oh
Yeah, it is
my.
actually we've had successful litigation challenging that bill, and it's coming on appeal. So the
Okay.
bill is still enacted, but we are having successful efforts to challenge it through litigation. The Texas state constitution is surprisingly supportive of local democracy.
Right, right. And actually what's interesting, oh man, we could go so many different directions of this, but like the Florida Constitution has a pretty strong home rule provision in it too, which
Hmm.
which is why, it has made conservative capture of the courts so important. And so just to bring it back to
Exactly.
minimum wage, there was actually a legal issue about whether or not the state's preemption of local living wages or local minimum wages was constitutional because,
Mhm.
not to bore you with the backstory, but the voters had passed a constitutional amendment with the minimum wage stuff that potentially
Yep.
undid this preemption. And so just before Ron DeSantis was elected governor, there was a lawsuit that bubbled up to the Supreme Court, and they agreed to take this case that was going to decide whether or not this preemption was constitutional. DeSantis, like his first month in office, got to essentially overhaul the court. He got three new appointees. One of the first things the overhauled court did was like release this case and basically let a lower court ruling stand, which was upheld the preemption. Anyway, it shows like how important like sort of the legal side is to actually like enforcing this and then having like good faith
Absolutely.
judges that consider this stuff. So I'm sorry, I'm rambling again, but on the Death Star stuff, so we've had in Florida, they've done a couple of different ones. There was an initial attempt to try and like essentially give businesses standing to sue any local government that passed an
Yes.
ordinance that affected its profits. And
Yes.
Ron DeSantis actually vetoed that bill. And like there was a brief window in 2022 when he was running for reelection, and all he cared about was driving up the score as much as possible in a general election, where he briefly governed like a pro-consumer guy for about 6 months,
Yes.
and he vetoed.
I remember that.
Yeah, he vetoed that bill. But then the legislature came back the next year and passed like a very similar bill, which is now in effect, where a business can sue to enjoin any local ordinance if they make the case that it's, I think the language is like arbitrary and capricious and stuff. And it basically creates at minimum an auto injunction to delay a local ordinance that, a
Yep.
developer doesn't like or something. But what are some of the other kind of Death Star approaches you've seen beyond sort of this Texas one, which I don't even understand the point of having local governments if the law says local governments can only do exactly what the state says they can do?
Well, that's the point.
Right.
Like that is the aim, right?
Right.
And how many times the Texas legislature has threatened to take over the city of Austin and make it a
Right.
capital district, right? The longer that we're in this battle, the more clear it becomes what they're actually trying to do. And it is about advancing an authoritarian state. It is about consolidating power in the wealthy few and those at the highest levels. So you're absolutely hitting on it. And I would just say one other piece about that Florida legislation with businesses being able to sue. The initial draft, I don't know what it's like in the draft that passed, but the initial version of it also prohibited the city, if they won, from recouping any legal fees.
That's right. That's right. But the
And
business
so,
could get legal fees. It was one-way attorney
exactly.
fees, right?
Exactly. And so it was really aimed at there is this chilling
Right.
effect, right? They're really trying to scare localities from doing anything, even having a debate. And most state legislatures have a speech and debate protection clause, right? That
Right.
protects legislators from being
Right.
held, punished for what they say on the floor. That doesn't usually exist for local elected officials. So
Right.
they're far more vulnerable. And that's a lot of why the preemptions that we see also include really punitive measures.
Right.
And Florida has been at the forefront of the punitive measures and the ability to sue an elected official like a mayor in their personal capacity and prevent them from being able to use any city resources to protect themselves.
Right.
So it's just so these Death Star bills, the way that they have evolved, it just really is getting clear what the aim is. And the aim is to just stop local governments from existing, from being able
Right.
to do what their communities want, and consolidate power at the highest levels.
Right, right. It does seem to me, it has always seemed to me that it is inevitable. The end game here is sort of, you mentioned like Texas talking about taking over the city of Austin. And we had a
Right.
situation in Florida where the voters in the city of Key West passed some local measures to prevent large cruise ships from docking
Absolutely.
in Key West because they're like doing all sorts of environmental damage. The legislature overturned that, and then when like Key West people were really angry about it and sort of like really coming at the legislature, somebody drafted a bill to abolish the city of Key West to just merge
Yep.
it with the county, right? And I know I've read some. I'm not an expert on it, but in Georgia, the Georgia legislature has talked about like carving out essentially the white areas of or the wealthiest areas of Atlanta into its
Yes.
own city, essentially gutting
Yes.
the budget of Atlanta that way. And it does.
Absolutely.
Have we seen any examples of legislatures just like abolishing a city at this point? Like obviously it seems like it's inevitable to me, but have we
Yep.
seen it happen anywhere?
Jackson, Mississippi. The state legislature actually has taken control of Jackson, Mississippi, and now if you live in Jackson, you're actually governed by three different police forces. You have the city force, you have the county force, and you have the newly constituted state capital force because they
Right.
have changed the jurisdiction. So that's the other piece that we're seeing with abusive preemption. It's taking over cities, and there's also a piece of really militarizing and creating a police state. And so we also see a lot of preemptions that are aimed at preventing any sort of police reform,
Right.
community oversight boards, any sort of, we saw a bill in Memphis, or actually in Tennessee last year that was targeting Memphis, who had just passed some new traffic stop regulations in the wake of another police murder of a black man.
Right.
And so the state actually came with a bill that said we're removing all local authority to change police oversight, period, not just
Wow.
traffic stops. And so the win, quote unquote, in that situation was getting the bill watered down to only target traffic stops.
Right.
That was, that's pretty twisted,
You're
to be
right.
honest,
Right.
right? Um, and so it really is just it, and I think, the abusive preemption we really see as part and parcel with all of the other efforts to erode our democracy. You've talked about court stacking, right? And what DeSantis has done in Florida. We're seeing that all over the country. Gerrymandering for state legislative power, right? Voting rights. And we see preemption being used, like you talked about, in election administration, and
Right.
also the ability of local governments to take private resources. So we're seeing folks try to use preemption to starve the ability of localities to actually run elections. And so this is really something that's part of something much, much bigger. And that's exactly what we're seeing happening today across our entire country.
Yeah, it's wild to me that every single issue that we talk about from the you mentioned in another state, I know we have seen in Florida at this point. So, like for instance, we just had a bill pass, I think last year I think that abolished local civilian oversight boards of police. So there's like
Yep. Mhm.
essentially no mechanism for locals to hold rogue cops accountable in Florida anymore. You mentioned like we have passed a couple of years ago, we passed a law that prohibited local elections offices from taking like private
Yep.
donations to help fund elections. That was
Yep.
the Zuckerbucks thing on the right.
Yes. Yes.
And I bring this up because like it seems pretty clear to me that this is obviously there are interest groups or organizations coordinating this across state. This is essentially a national effort, but it's taking place individually in a bunch of different state capitals.
Yep.
Is that how you think about it, or tell me more
Oh,
about sort of like
absolutely.
yeah the coordination you see across state capitals or
Oh,
the sort of
it's incredibly coordinated. I mean, and literally down to copying and pasting bills. And we
right
have seen, and they're not necessarily even always good at it. Like we've
right
we've seen bills where they forget to change the state name in the template,
right
ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, is one
right
of the biggest proponents out there of abusive preemption bills. But there are a lot of other groups, and one that I want to highlight because they've been working in Florida is the Cicero Institute.
right
And
tech
they came on our
bros.
radar. It's what?
It's Tech Bros, Joe
Yeah,
Lonsdale.
well, it's
Right.
Peter Thiel to be very
Oh, is that
specific.
right? Oh, I didn't even know that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So that is a conservative think tank. We saw it pop up, I want to say 3 legislative sessions ago in Arizona. Maybe
Mm,
it might have been 2 legislative sessions ago. And then we wrote a white paper talking about the criminalization of homelessness
right.
because that was their big issue and trying to basically extort cities to criminalize homelessness, saying if you don't pass policies that criminalize people for being unhoused, we will withhold state funding.
Right.
Right. And so that bill did not pass in Arizona, but it did pass in Florida last
Right.
session.
Yeah,
And the
that's
Cicero Institute was there at the signing with DeSantis. So there are a lot of these groups out there. There's absolutely a concerted effort. And we know when we see a bill pop up in Arizona, Texas, Florida, those 3 in particular, we need to be preparing Tennessee and Pennsylvania
right.
and right and Missouri and all of the other places because we know what's coming. And that's a big function of what we do at the local solution support center is to have that 30,000-foot view of what's popping in some place so that we can prepare other people for it.
That makes sense. Yeah, Cicero was not only at the bill signing ceremony, but I believe it was Ryan Gillespie, a reporter at the Orlando Sentinel, that broke this. They caught them. They literally wrote the Florida bill, and the Florida bill
Absolutely.
landed at. Yeah, I don't believe they withheld funding from cities that don't essentially make it illegal to sleep outside. What they did was
Mhm.
they created another private cause of action that anybody could essentially sue the local government. The same way that sort of Death Star preemption in Florida we talked about, the same kind of enforcement mechanism. One last question on preemption, sort of like the trends. In my mind, I kind of think of it as, and maybe this is because I'm in a red state, that this is probably a red state phenomenon where you see the urban rural divide play. You have like state legislatures that are very Republican, but in states where there are cities that are very, progressive or democratic passing it. And that's where you see this preemption dynamic play out. Is that the right way to think about it, or do you see it in other contexts? Like, does preemption show up in? I don't even know of a situation where you'd have a Democratic state. There's not like a heavy concentration of Republican voters, but maybe in like rural communities or something like that. I just where do you see this pop up the most?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the most common thing is a red state punishing a blue city, but
Right.
that is only part of the story.
Okay.
And so first of all, I think part of our work is in working with state and local advocates and elected officials is to really help folks understand that when one city loses authority, everyone loses authority. And
Right.
whether or not a rural community wants to pass the same policies as an urban community, if all cities lose authority to pass a policy on X issue, everybody loses the authority.
Right.
So that's one piece that's really important. I want to share an example of a blue state having abusive preemption,
Hmm.
and it's California. And this was several years ago, and it's actually a really troubling it's a troubling story on many levels. So the Beverage Association had invested millions of dollars in a ballot initiative that would have preempted all local revenue increases for every city in the state of California.
The
And so they
I'm
had
I'm sorry.
invested.
I'm sorry. Just to make sure I'm understanding, preempted
Yes.
revenue in like any. I don't even
Yeah.
understand what that means. Like that, I'm having
Like
trouble wrapping.
no city in the state of California could have increased their revenue. Right.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Wow, that's
exactly. No, that's
bonkers.
exactly the
Right.
reaction. Like basically, again, local governments couldn't have functioned. They couldn't
Right.
have raised taxes. They couldn't have, right? They could not have been able to adapt to whatever is going on.
Right.
And in a state like California, could have been extremely challenging, right?
Right.
Given all
Right.
of it, just looking at the climate, the climate issues,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So what the Beverage Association did was they took this to the democratically led legislature and said, if you preempt sugary drink taxes for like the next decade, we'll withdraw the ballot initiative.
Oh my God, it's blackmail.
Exactly. And the legislature did it. Now
Wow.
that law, the law preempting sugary drink tax preemption has actually been struck down by the courts. So we actually did have a legal victory in challenging it, but it was a really good lesson about, we need our democratic lawmakers to also understand the importance of local democracy and their role in protecting it.
Right.
And that's part of our ultimate vision at Local Solutions Support Center, is that we need every level of government working in tandem to address the most critical needs of their residents.
Yeah.
We need strong local governments. We need strong state governments. We need strong federal government. Everyone has a role to play to address the historic and ongoing systemic oppression of our people.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think through like, I can't think of a more like bipartisan issue at the local level in Florida than preemption to folks who get it. Like there are tons of voters in some of the most conservative parts of the state that get furious at the legislature when it, for instance, preempts like rules around like wetland buffers or particularly
Right.
environmental preemptions. We've had a number of efforts to try and strengthen like protections for lakes and rivers and stuff that have been preempted by the home building lobbies. Has been the biggest driving force behind those preemptions, and that drives. I've talked to many people in places like Sarasota. I bring up as a pretty Republican area, Naples as a Republican area, who are furious with the legislature for that sort of
Yep.
thing. So it is really a nonpartisan issue in that lens. That's a good transition in that. One question I wanted to ask you. So I mentioned to you offline, and I talked about it in the opening to the show, but the seed for this was this discussion I had where a bunch of really smart, successful people who are engaged in politics had no idea what preemption was. And so I
Yep.
wonder that you guys working in this space, do you have any, and I just like I struggle to write about it because it's such a technical word, it's such a dry term. Like there's a lot of like it feels like there's a lot of like teaching that has to happen just to like set up like why you should be pissed off about this, dear reader. Do you guys have any advice or what have you learned about what's the best way to talk about this in a way that like communicates to people on the stakes here, that gets people engaged and understanding? Just how do you sort
Yep.
of make people understand and care?
Well, it's a great question. And it is honestly something that we and all of our partners across the ecosystem have and continue to struggle with,
Mm-hmm.
because preemption itself is wonky.
Right.
And trying to make it sexy for, a general audience is really tough, because the reality is generations of eroding public education mean that most people, most regular people who are not in politics, don't necessarily know what level of government should be doing what for them. They just
Right.
know that they deserve support, right? And so we do have to work extra hard to be able to help folks make the connection. And so we actually we've done extensive messaging research over the years and done it in conjunction with all of our partners who are on the front lines of these fights. And what we've learned is that first we have to start with the issue, make that connection to folks, and then talking about how local governments are losing authority to corporate elites and special interests and social conservatives, and how this is another way in which these people's power is being taken away from them. There's actually the opportunity to really galvanize people and to help connect the dots. It's not just the wetlands. It's not just worker protections. It's not just public health policies. It's all of these things together, and it is all a part of this broader effort. And when we can help people make that connection, it doesn't have to even use the word preemption.
Mm-hmm.
It is about people taking power away. It is about corporate elites making profit on the backs of working people. It is about the historic and ongoing effort to continue excluding certain communities, and to consolidate power and wealth. And
Mm-hmm.
when you can have that conversation with people and do it in a cross issue, cross movement way, we're helping people to be able to understand what's really at stake. And honestly, it is in our benefit that our opposition is getting more and more overt
Right.
and less fearful. Where they once used to mask their intent, they're not masking it anymore. And it actually makes our job of educating people that much easier.
Right, right. Well, that is terrifying, but also a little optimistic. So that seems as good a place as any to end a Preemption 101 course here. Thank you for doing this. This was a fascinating discussion. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I always love nerding out about abusive preemption. So thanks for the opportunity.
Well, there's no better place to nerd out on something than the podcast called Seeking Rents. So, all right. Thank you again.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to stop the recording. All right. Thank you once again to Katie Belanger for joining the show. I need to noodle this over a bit more. I may try and organize a few more episodes over the next like weeks or months about drilling even deeper into preemption and into some of the different ways it's been used. And also this idea we talked about on the show that it is absolutely sort of morphing into just like raw takeovers where it's not enough to just strip the ability of a city to raise its minimum wage or, regulate like plastic bags or litter or, it's not enough to overturn litter ordinances. Now it's just abolishing cities altogether or outright stealing their most valuable assets. Right. So we might do some more around those issues on this podcast in the coming weeks. I just need to sort of noodle that over. But anyway, I learned a lot. I hope you did. As always, if you get a chance, if you think of it, click the like or subscribe buttons. That's really helpful to getting this this Preemption 101 lesson out to more folks. If you've got any thoughts, if you leave a comment, send me an email, leave a review of the show. That's always really helpful too. And then, as always, if you haven't already, please think about signing up for the newsletter. Easiest place to find us is seekingrentsfl.com. That'll ensure that every story we write and every podcast we record is sent straight to your inbox. You'll never miss a show or a piece. As always, nothing is behind a paywall, nor will it ever be. Everything is all our content is free to all. We want people to have the exact same information that people who can afford to pay for really expensive paywalls also have access. We want to democratize information here. But there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford one. If you've got the means and you value the work we're doing here, please do think about doing that. Those paid subscriptions, the revenue we get from paid subscriptions is incredibly important to helping cover reporting expenses. Like a common one for me is the cost of public records requests. So you've got the means, please think about that paid subscription. Okay, we'll leave it there. We'll be back again, like I said, probably tomorrow, just so I can say I'm recording on day 100 of the session. But until then, talk again soon.